In the spring of 1847, a white plantation owner, his wife, and one of their household slaves vanished overnight from their Louisiana estate. The letter left behind read, "We have committed the unforgivable sin of love." For 3 weeks, newspapers speculated about kidnapping and madness. Then the truth emerged. The plantation owner had abandoned everything to elope with a woman who was legally his property. But when investigators uncovered what had been happening at Riverside Plantation, they found something far darker than forbidden romance. Before we continue with the story of Riverside Plantation and the 3 people whose choices would expose the rot at the heart of plantation society, hit that subscribe button right now and drop your state or city in the comments below. I want to know how far these forgotten American scandals reach. The perfect marriage. That wasn't Charleston society in 1832 celebrated the union of Margaret Whitmore and Edward Bellamy as the marriage of the decade. She was the daughter of a shipping magnate, educated in Paris, fluent in 3 languages, and possessed of a dowry that included 500 acres of prime Mississippi River land. He was the son of a tobacco dynasty, Harvard-educated, and considered one of the most eligible bachelors in the South. The wedding took place at St. Michael's Church on a September morning, when the heat had finally broken and the air carried the first hint of autumn. 200 guests witnessed the ceremony. The reception lasted until dawn. What Charleston society did not know was that Edward Bellamy had spent the night before his wedding in the slave quarters, and that the pattern would continue for the next 15 years. The marriage began as these things often did among the Southern aristocracy. 2 families negotiating alliances, combining wealth and lineage, ensuring the continuation of power structures that had governed the region since before the Revolution. Margaret understood her role. She would manage the household, bear children, host gatherings that cemented her husband's position in society. Edward understood his role as well. He would provide, protect, maintain the reputation and prosperity that their union represented. They were both 23 years old on their wedding day. They barely knew each other. The first year passed in a haze of social obligations and the careful choreography of establishing a household. Edward purchased Riverside Plantation with money from Margaret's dowry, 800 acres along the Mississippi River north of New Orleans. The land was good, the location convenient to river traffic, the house suitably grand for a couple of their standing. Margaret supervised the furnishing of their home with the same methodical attention she brought to everything, selecting wallpaper from Paris and furniture from Charleston workshops. Edward threw himself into the business of becoming a planter, learning the rhythms of cotton cultivation, hiring overseers, purchasing slaves. They were pleasant to each other. They fulfilled their obligations. Margaret became pregnant in the 2nd year of their marriage and delivered a son in the 3rd. A daughter followed 2 years later. The household expanded. The plantation prospered. To anyone observing from outside, the Bellamys represented everything that was right and proper about Southern society. But Edward had begun spending his evenings away from the main house. At first, Margaret assumed he was attending to plantation business, consulting with his overseers, checking on livestock or equipment. Then she noticed that the evenings away always coincided with certain phases of the moon, always lasted exactly the same length of time, always left him with an expression she could not quite read when he finally returned to their bed. She said nothing. Southern wives learned early that certain questions remained unasked. Edward was discreet. He showed her every courtesy. He never embarrassed her publicly. And so Margaret played her part, managing the household, raising their children, hosting dinners where she smiled and charmed, and never once let anyone see the careful calculation behind her eyes. She told herself this was simply how marriages worked. She told herself she was content. She told herself these things right up until the night she stopped believing them. Celeste, the woman who changed everything. She arrived at Riverside Plantation in 1835, purchased at a New Orleans auction for what the ledger recorded as an unusual sum for a domestic. Celeste was 20 years old, the daughter of a French planter and an enslaved woman from Saint-Domingue, and she possessed a combination of beauty, intelligence, and composure that made her immediately distinctive. The auctioneer had presented her as educated, fluent in French and English, trained in the arts of a lady's maid. Edward Bellamy bid against 3 other planters before securing her purchase for nearly twice what he had paid for any previous slave. Margaret was present at the auction. She watched her husband's face as he studied Celeste on the platform. She saw something flicker in his expression, something she had not seen in the 3 years of their marriage. When the gavel fell and Celeste became their property, Margaret felt a cold certainty settle into her chest. This woman would change everything. Edward assigned Celeste to serve as Margaret's personal attendant, a position that required daily proximity to both master and mistress. Celeste would help Margaret dress each morning, arrange her hair, manage her correspondence, accompany her on social calls. The intimacy of the role meant that Celeste observed everything about the Bellamy household. She saw how Edward and Margaret spoke to each other with careful politeness but no warmth. She saw how Margaret's smile never quite reached her eyes. She saw how Edward spent his evenings in his study, drinking alone, staring at papers he was not actually reading. Celeste had learned young to make herself invisible when necessary and compelling when useful. She understood that her position at Riverside depended on pleasing both the master and mistress, on navigating the impossible space between servant and something more. She was careful never to overstep, never to presume, never to give Margaret reason to demand her removal. But she also understood that Edward Bellamy was lonely in ways that his marriage did not address, and that loneliness made him vulnerable. The first conversation happened in the library on a rainy afternoon when Margaret had gone to visit neighbors. Edward asked Celeste if she could read. When she confirmed that she could, he offered her a book from his shelves, a volume of French poetry. They discussed it the next day, then another book, then another. The conversations lengthened. Edward began asking about her life before Riverside, about her mother who had died when she was 12, about the planter who had fathered her and then sold her when his legitimate wife demanded it. Within 6 months, the household dynamics at Riverside had begun to shift in ways that the other slaves noticed, but dared not speak about. Edward spent less time with the overseers and more time in the main house. Celeste's quarters, a small room off the kitchen, began to show improvements. A better mattress, a lamp for reading, fabric for dresses that was finer than what the other house slaves received. The cook whispered to the stable hands that the master was falling. The stable hands whispered to the field workers that trouble was coming. And everyone watched Margaret's face for signs of the storm they knew was gathering. Margaret's suspicions. Margaret Bellamy was not a stupid woman, though society had taught her to perform stupidity when convenient. She had been educated by tutors who believed women capable of serious thought, had read philosophy and history, had learned to calculate household accounts with precision that would shame most men. She noticed everything. She forgot nothing. And by the autumn of 1835, she knew with absolute certainty that her husband was falling in love with her slave. She noticed how Edward's eyes followed Celeste through a room, not with the casual, predatory gaze that many slaveholders turned on their female property, but with something deeper and more dangerous. Longing. She noticed the quality of the fabric he ordered for the slave women's dresses, far finer than necessary, and how Celeste's dresses were always the finest of all. She noticed how certain evenings he would claim exhaustion and retire early, yet when she passed his chamber hours later, she could hear voices through the door, 2 voices, speaking in tones too low to distinguish words, but too intimate to mistake intent. The evidence accumulated slowly. A book missing from the library, later discovered in Celeste's quarters. Edward's handwriting on a slip of paper tucked into a volume of poetry. A line about beauty that transcended circumstance. The way Celeste sometimes looked at Margaret with something that might have been pity or might have been triumph. Margaret could not tell which, and the uncertainty ate at her. She considered her options. She could confront Edward, demand that he sell Celeste, threaten scandal if he refused. But such confrontations had risks. Edward might refuse. He might grow to resent her. He might become more discreet but continue the relationship in ways she could not monitor. And scandal would damage Margaret's standing as much as Edward's. Society forgave men their indiscretions but judged wives harshly for failing to maintain domestic harmony. She could arrange for Celeste to have an accident. This was not unheard of in plantation households where jealous wives dealt with inconvenient rivals. A fall downstairs, a sudden illness, a sale to a planter known for brutality. But Margaret found she could not quite bring herself to such measures. She was angry, yes, and hurt in ways she had not expected to feel about a husband she had never loved. But she was not murderous. Not yet. Instead, she watched. She documented. She kept careful mental records of every glance, every private conversation, every moment when Edward and Celeste thought themselves unobserved. She was building a case, though she did not yet know what verdict she sought. Divorce was impossible. Separation would destroy both their families. But continuing as they were, pretending not to notice while her husband conducted his affair under her own roof, felt like a slow death of dignity. The breaking point came on a December evening when Margaret entered the library unannounced and found Edward and Celeste standing close together, his hand on her arm, their faces inches apart. They sprang apart when they saw her. Edward stammered an excuse about discussing household matters. Celeste's face remained perfectly composed, but her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her dress. Margaret looked at them both with an expression of such cold fury that Edward actually stepped backward. That night, Margaret did not sleep. She sat in her chambers, calculating, planning, deciding what price she was willing to pay to maintain her position, and what price was simply too high to bear. The arrangement. The conversation happened in Margaret's sitting room on a humid afternoon in August 1837. Edward had been careless, leaving a note in a coat pocket that Margaret discovered while supervising the laundry. The handwriting was his own, but the words were addressed to someone he called "my dearest heart." The content left no doubt about the nature of his relationship with Celeste. Margaret folded the note carefully and placed it in her writing desk. Then she sent word to Edward that she required an immediate private audience. He arrived within the hour, his face pale, knowing somehow that the reckoning had come. Margaret did not scream. She did not weep. She sat in the chair by the window with perfect posture, her hands folded in her lap, and spoke with the calm precision of a lawyer presenting a case. She described what she had observed over the past 2 years. She produced the note. She outlined the social consequences if the affair became public knowledge. She detailed exactly how thoroughly such a scandal would destroy both their families, their children's prospects, everything they had built. Edward listened in silence, his shame evident but his defiance growing as she spoke. When she finished, he surprised her by not denying anything. Instead, he asked her what she wanted from him. The confrontation that followed did not lead to the separation that might have occurred in another family. Instead, it led to something far stranger, a negotiation. Margaret had spent the weeks since discovering the note considering her options. She understood that she could not force Edward to end the relationship. If she demanded he sell Celeste, he might refuse, and then where would her authority be? If she created a scandal by divorcing him, she would lose everything. Society would blame her for failing to keep her husband's affections. Her children would be tainted. Her family's name would suffer. But she also could not continue living in deliberate ignorance, pretending not to know what everyone in the household already knew. So Margaret proposed an arrangement that would preserve appearances while acknowledging realities that could not be changed. Edward could continue his relationship with Celeste, but certain conditions would be maintained. First, absolute discretion. No displays of affection where the household staff might witness, no treating Celeste as anything other than property in public settings. Second, Margaret's authority over the household would remain absolute. She would continue to manage Riverside, to make all decisions regarding domestic matters, and Edward would support her authority publicly. Third, any children born of the relationship would be acknowledged as slave children only, with no special treatment that might raise questions. Fourth, Margaret would maintain her position as Edward's wife in every social context, accompanying him to gatherings, hosting dinners, performing all the duties expected of a plantation mistress. In exchange, Margaret would not object to Edward's relationship with Celeste. She would even facilitate it in small ways, ensuring that their private time together went undisturbed. She would treat Celeste with the courtesy due to a valued servant, nothing more and nothing less. Edward stared at her as though she had grown a second head. "What you propose is madness," he said. "What I propose is survival," Margaret replied. "This is the best offer you will receive. Accept it, or we can proceed with the scandal. The choice is yours." After a long silence, Edward nodded. The bargain they struck that day would hold for nearly a decade, creating a domestic arrangement that existed nowhere else in Louisiana society, at least not so openly acknowledged between husband and wife. 3 people, 1 household. The years between 1837 and 1845 created a domestic situation that existed nowhere else in Louisiana society, at least not openly. Edward divided his time between his wife's chambers, which he visited rarely and only for purposes of maintaining appearances, and the small house behind the main plantation building where Celeste lived. Margaret maintained her role as mistress of Riverside, hosting parties and managing the social obligations of their class with a precision that earned praise from other plantation wives. And Celeste occupied a position that had no name, neither slave nor mistress nor wife, but something unprecedented. The small house where Celeste lived had been built, originally as quarters for a plantation overseer, but Edward had it renovated with an attention to detail that raised eyebrows among the construction workers. Real glass in the windows, a fireplace with a proper chimney, wooden floors instead of packed earth, furniture that would not have been out of place in the main house, books on shelves, a desk for writing. When the work was complete, Edward moved Celeste from her room off the kitchen to these new quarters, and the message to everyone at Riverside could not have been clearer. The other slaves whispered that the devil himself had made a home at Riverside. They whispered about how Master Edward would leave the main house after dinner and not return until dawn. They whispered about how Miss Margaret would stand at her window watching the lamp burning in Celeste's house, her face revealing nothing. They whispered about how Celeste walked through the plantation with her head high, speaking to the other slaves with courtesy but never familiarity, maintaining a distance that acknowledged her impossible position. Some of the house slaves resented Celeste for the privileges her relationship with Edward brought her. Others pitied her for the trap she occupied, neither free nor fully enslaved, dependent entirely on Edward's continued favor. The field slaves considered her a curiosity, someone who had somehow managed to alter the fixed rules of plantation life through means they did not fully understand. But everyone agreed that the situation could not last. Something would break. Someone would act. The arrangement was too strange, too fragile, too dependent on all three parties maintaining a fiction that grew more elaborate with each passing year. Edward himself seemed to split into two men. In public, at social gatherings and business meetings, he was the respectable planter, attentive to his wife, careful of his reputation, conventional in every visible way. But in the evenings, in the small house behind the main plantation building, he became someone else. He read poetry with Celeste. He discussed philosophy. He taught her mathematics and history. He treated her as an intellectual equal in ways that would have been considered dangerous and subversive if anyone outside the household had known. Margaret played her role with a discipline that amazed even those who knew her well. She hosted dinners where she praised her husband publicly. She managed their social calendar. She raised their children, two by then, with stories about their father's fine qualities. She never once, in public, betrayed the knowledge of what her evenings contained while Edward was absent. She cultivated friendships with other plantation wives who had no idea that the woman they admired for her grace under pressure was maintaining one of the most unusual domestic arrangements in the South. But there was a cost. Margaret grew harder, colder, more controlled with each passing year. The warmth that had once existed in her, whatever small capacity for joy she had brought to her marriage, froze over. She became efficient, methodical, precise in all things. She wasted nothing, not time, not money, not words. She smiled when necessary and spoke pleasantries as required, but those who knew her well understood that something essential had been burned out of her. And through it all, Celeste remained in her small house, reading her books, walking the grounds at dawn when few others were awake, existing in a space between worlds that only she fully understood. She was loved by a man who could not marry her. She was resented by a woman who could not dismiss her. She bore children who would be raised as slaves, and she endured it all with a composure that never quite cracked, at least not where anyone could see. The children. The first child was born in 1838, a girl with Celeste's features and Edward's eyes. The official story, carefully constructed and maintained, was that Celeste had been violated by an overseer who was immediately dismissed and run off the property. This fiction satisfied no one, but it provided the necessary social cover. The house slaves knew the truth. The field slaves guessed it. And Margaret, who had agreed to the arrangement, found herself confronting a reality she had not fully considered. The child existed. The child was her husband's, and the child would be raised as property on her own plantation. Margaret insisted on naming the girl. If this child was to exist under her roof, she would at least control that much. She chose the name Sarah, after no one in particular, a name that carried no family significance and made no claims. Edward accepted this. Celeste said nothing, and Sarah became the first visible consequence of the arrangement, a living reminder that could not be hidden or ignored. By 1845, Celeste had given birth to 4 children, all of them unmistakably Edward's. The careful fiction of the violated slave had worn thin after the second birth, and by the third, no one bothered maintaining it. The children were called the master's shadow children by some of the slaves, half-breeds by less charitable observers, and nothing at all by Margaret, who referred to them only indirectly when necessary. Edward acknowledged them all in ways that stopped just short of legal recognition. He could not free them without Margaret's consent as his wife, and she refused to grant it. But he could educate them, and he did. By the time the eldest was 5 years old, she could read better than many white children in the parish. He commissioned portraits of them, small paintings that he kept in his study. He spoke to them in French, teaching them the language their mother had learned from her own father. He bought them books and toys and clothing that marked them as different from other slave children. Margaret watched it all with an expression that revealed nothing. She had agreed to allow the children to exist. She had not agreed to love them. She maintained strict boundaries. The children were not permitted in the main house except when performing specific duties. They addressed her as mistress if they addressed her at all. They played in the yard behind Celeste's house, but never in the formal gardens. They existed in a carefully defined space that kept them separate from Margaret's legitimate children, who were growing up in the main house with no official knowledge of their half-siblings. The legitimate children knew anyway. Children always know. Edward and Margaret's son, Edward Jr., sometimes watched the shadow children from the upstairs windows, studying them with an intensity that worried his mother. The daughter, Caroline, once asked why the pretty slave children had a father who visited them, but they were not allowed to speak to him in public. Margaret explained that plantation life required certain separations, certain proprieties, and that Caroline should not concern herself with matters beneath her station. But the children were impossible to ignore. They represented the central contradiction of the arrangement. Margaret had agreed to allow Edward his relationship with Celeste. She had even agreed to tolerate the resulting children, but she had not anticipated how it would feel to watch her husband be tender with children who were not hers, to see him teach and play with, and obviously love these living embodiments of his betrayal. The youngest child, born in 1845, was a boy whom Edward named Thomas after his own father. This act of naming, claiming his father's name for a slave child, pushed Margaret's tolerance to its limit. She considered demanding that Edward stop. She considered breaking the arrangement. She considered many things during the long nights after Thomas was born. But in the end, she did nothing but add this new grievance to the careful accounting she kept in her mind, the running tally of insults and compromises that she told herself would one day be balanced. Or, when love became impossible to deny. Something shifted in Edward Bellamy during the winter of 1846. Those who knew him said he became distracted, melancholic, prone to long walks along the river where he would stand for hours staring at the water. His friends attributed it to business troubles or political concerns about the growing abolitionist movement in the North. Cotton prices had been unstable. There was talk of potential conflict between free and slave states. These were reasonable explanations for a planter's preoccupation, but the truth was simpler and more devastating. After 9 years of maintaining the arrangement, after 9 years of dividing himself between duty and desire, Edward Bellamy had finally admitted to himself that he was in love with a woman he could never marry. This was not the casual affection of a master for a favored slave. This was not the transactional relationship that many planters maintained with their property. Edward had fallen completely, irrevocably in love with Celeste, in ways that made his marriage to Margaret seem like a hollow performance. He loved the way Celeste thought, the way she parsed arguments and challenged his assumptions. He loved her dignity, the way she carried herself despite the impossible circumstances of her life. He loved how she mothered their children with a fierce protectiveness that never showed itself as weakness. He loved her completely, and the knowledge of that love was destroying him. The arrangement that had seemed workable in 1837 now felt like torture. Edward could not sit at dinner with Margaret without thinking of Celeste alone in her house. He could not participate in social gatherings without feeling like a fraud. He could not look at his legitimate children without seeing the injustice being done to his other children, who would never inherit, never bear his name legally, never be acknowledged as anything but property. He began drinking more heavily. He grew short-tempered with overseers and slaves alike. He stopped attending church, claiming illness, because he could not bear the hypocrisy of sitting in a pew listening to sermons about righteousness while maintaining a relationship that his society condemned and his conscience increasingly could not reconcile. Celeste noticed the change in him. During their evenings together, she would find him staring at her with an expression of such naked longing and despair that it frightened her. When she asked what troubled him, he could not find words to explain. How could he tell her that he wanted to give her things that were impossible? That he wanted to walk with her in public as his wife? That he wanted their children to be free? That he wanted to wake each morning knowing he would spend the entire day with her, not just stolen hours after dark? The crisis came in March of 1847, during a conversation that began with practical matters and ended with Edward speaking truths he had never articulated before. He told Celeste that he loved her, not as a master loves property, not as a man loves a mistress, but as a man loves his wife, his partner, his equal. He told her that the arrangement with Margaret had become unbearable. He told her that he lay awake at night, imagining impossible futures where they could live as a family, openly, without hiding. Celeste listened with an expression that moved between hope and fear. She had long since accepted that her life would be defined by limitations. She had made peace with loving a man who could never fully belong to her. She had learned to find joy in the small spaces the arrangement allowed. But Edward's words opened possibilities she had trained herself not to consider, and the opening of those possibilities felt both thrilling and dangerous. "What are you saying?" she asked. "I am saying that I cannot continue this way," Edward replied. "I am saying that something must change. But what can change? You are married. I am your property. Our children are slaves. These are not circumstances we can alter with wishes. Then we will alter them with action," Edward said, and though he did not yet know how, he meant it completely. Margaret's breaking point. The moment came during a dinner party in March 1847, when a guest made a casual comment about Edward's unusually well-cared-for house staff. The observation was innocent enough, but something in the way the guest's wife smiled when she said it, something knowing and cruel, made Margaret's carefully maintained composure crack. The woman was implying that she knew. She was suggesting that everyone knew. And Margaret understood in that instant that her arrangement, her careful preservation of appearances, had failed. Society saw through the fiction. They whispered about Riverside. They judged her. She made it through the remainder of the dinner through sheer force of will. She smiled. She poured wine. She discussed the weather and upcoming social events with perfect grace. But inside, something fundamental had broken. That night, after the guests departed, Margaret waited for Edward in his study. When he entered, already loosening his collar and preparing for his nightly walk to Celeste's house, he found his wife sitting in his chair, her hands folded, her expression harder than he had ever seen it. "We need to discuss the arrangement," she said. "The arrangement is over." Edward froze in the doorway. "Margaret, we agreed. We agreed to a fiction that I thought would protect us both. It has not. The entire parish knows about your slave mistress and your bastard children. They know and they pity me. Do you understand what that means? I have maintained this household with dignity. I have performed every duty expected of me, and still I am the object of pity. What do you want me to do?" Edward asked, though he already knew the answer. "I want you to send her away. Sell her, sell the children, end this obscenity." "You agreed to the children's existence," Edward said, his voice rising. "You agreed to all of it. I agreed because I thought discretion would protect my position. I was wrong. And I will not continue to humiliate myself by allowing this situation to persist under my own roof." Edward stood silent for a long moment, then quietly. He said, "I will not sell her. I will not sell the children." "Then you leave me no choice," Margaret replied. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. "I have been patient. I have been accommodating. I have sacrificed my dignity to maintain this family's reputation, but I will not sacrifice it further. You will send that woman away, or I will take action that will destroy us both." "What action? Divorce?" "You would not dare. The scandal would ruin your family as much as mine. Perhaps, Margaret said. But at least I would not have to see her face every day. At least I would not have to know that my husband prefers the company of his slave to his wife. At least I would have my self-respect. Edward sank into a chair, the fight draining out of him. Margaret, please. Please what? Please continue living this lie. Please continue pretending that our marriage is anything but a business arrangement, that you have violated in the worst possible way. She stood, smoothing her dress with shaking hands. You have 1 month, Edward. 1 month to make arrangements. Send her somewhere else. I do not care where, but she cannot remain at Riverside. The children can stay if you insist, but she must go. And if I refuse, then I will create the scandal you fear. I will tell my family everything. I will ensure that every newspaper from here to Charleston knows the name Celeste and knows exactly what you have done. I will burn down everything we have built, and I will not care about the consequences because the consequences cannot possibly be worse than continuing to live this way. She walked to the door, then paused. You have given me 9 years of humiliation, Edward. I am done accepting it. The impossible decision. For 3 weeks, Edward Bellamy wrestled with a choice that should not have existed. Southern society provided clear answers to such situations. A white man might keep a slave mistress, might father children with her, might even feel affection for her, but he did not abandon his legitimate wife and children for such a woman. He did not sacrifice his social standing, his property, his very identity as a member of the planter class. To do so would be to commit social suicide, to make himself an outcast, to betray everything his family represented. Yet with each passing day, Edward found himself drawing closer to doing exactly that. He tried to imagine sending Celeste away. He could sell her to a planter in Texas or Mississippi, somewhere far enough that he would never see her again. He could provide enough money to ensure she was treated well. He could even arrange for her eventual manumission, though it would take years and careful legal maneuvering. This was the sensible solution. The solution that would preserve his marriage, maintain his position, keep Riverside intact for his legitimate children to inherit. But when he imagined actually doing it, imagined telling Celeste that she must leave, imagined never seeing her again, never speaking with her, never watching their children grow, he found he could not breathe. The thought produced a physical reaction, a tightness in his chest that felt like drowning. He tried to imagine Margaret's alternative, continuing the arrangement but moving Celeste to a property elsewhere, visiting her occasionally, maintaining the relationship at a distance. But this felt like a half measure that would satisfy no one. Margaret would still know. Celeste would still be enslaved. The children would still grow up as property. And Edward would still be divided, still caught between 2 lives, still unable to claim the one he wanted. For the first time, Edward allowed himself to consider the impossible. What if he simply left? What if he took Celeste and the children and disappeared? People did it sometimes, though rarely. The Underground Railroad moved fugitive slaves north. Abolitionists provided assistance to those fleeing slavery. If he could reach free territory, if he could get to Canada, or perhaps even Europe, he could start over. He would lose Riverside. He would lose his legitimate children. He would lose his name, his reputation, everything he had built. But he would have Celeste. He would have their children. He would have a life lived honestly instead of divided. The idea terrified him. It also filled him with something he had not felt in years: hope. Edward began making discreet inquiries. He spoke with a merchant who had abolitionist sympathies, asking hypothetical questions about routes north. He withdrew money from his accounts in small amounts that would not raise immediate suspicion. He wrote letters to business contacts in Philadelphia and New York, establishing relationships that might prove useful. He did all of this while maintaining his normal routine, attending to plantation business, dining with Margaret in cold silence, trying not to let anyone see the revolution taking place inside him. The decision crystallized during a conversation with his son, Edward Jr., who was now 12 years old. The boy asked his father about inheritance, about what it meant to be a Bellamy, about the responsibilities that came with their name and position. Edward found himself giving the expected answers, talking about duty and family and legacy. But as he spoke, he realized that he was teaching his son to value the same things that had trapped him: property, reputation, social position. The willingness to sacrifice personal happiness for the sake of maintaining appearances. Did he want this for his son? Did he want Edward Jr. to grow into a man who measured success by land owned and slaves controlled, who saw people as property and love as something to be carefully managed for maximum social advantage? That night, Edward walked to Celeste's house and told her they were leaving. He expected her to argue, to point out all the ways the plan could fail. Instead, she simply asked when, and in that moment, the impossible decision became merely difficult. The path was set. All that remained was finding the courage to walk it. Planning the escape. The conspiracy began in the small house behind the main plantation building, where Edward and Celeste spoke in whispers about possibilities that seemed like madness. They could not simply walk away. Edward's property was entailed, legally tied to his legitimate heirs through complex inheritance structures established by his father. His bank accounts were monitored by business partners who would notice large withdrawals. His movements were observed by a social network that noticed everything. A planter did not simply disappear without questions being asked, searches being organized, authorities being notified, and Celeste was property herself, legally incapable of leaving without papers of manumission that Edward did not have the authority to grant without Margaret's consent as his wife. Under Louisiana law, slaves required written permission to travel beyond plantation boundaries. Any white person could stop Celeste and demand to see her papers. If she could not produce them, she would be arrested as a fugitive, and any white man traveling with a fugitive slave would face prosecution for theft. The legal obstacles were enormous. The practical obstacles were worse. They would need to move 5 people, including 4 children ranging from 9 years old to 2. They would need money that Edward could access without raising suspicion. They would need a route that avoided slave patrols and bounty hunters. They would need help from people who had every reason to distrust a Southern planter, claiming he wanted to free his slaves. The solution they devised required help from an unexpected source. Through a trusted slave at Riverside, an older man named Marcus who had connections throughout the region, Edward made contact with a network he had spent his entire life condemning. The Underground Railroad operated in Louisiana despite the obvious dangers, moving fugitive slaves north through a series of safe houses in careful coordination. But the network was suspicious of any white Southerner, and especially suspicious of planters. Marcus arranged a meeting with a free black woman named Sarah Thompson, who coordinated Underground Railroad activities in New Orleans. The meeting took place in the back room of a shop in the French Quarter at midnight, with Marcus present as guarantee of Edward's intentions. Sarah listened to Edward's proposal with an expression of deep skepticism. "You want us to help you run away with your slave mistress," she said flatly, "so you can continue your relationship without your wife's interference." "This is not about the relationship," Edward replied. "This is about freedom. I want to manumit Celeste and our children. I want them to live as free people." "Then manumit them here and stay yourself," Sarah said. "Petition the courts. Follow proper procedures. You know I cannot get Margaret's consent. So you want to steal your own property and expect us to aid you in the theft." Edward flinched at the phrasing but could not deny its accuracy. "I am asking for help in giving freedom to 5 people who deserve it. You are asking us to risk our lives and our network for your personal drama." Sarah stood to leave. "I will not do it." "Wait," Edward said. He pulled out a packet of papers he had prepared. "These are maps of patrol routes used by slave catchers, names of planters who pay bounties for returned fugitives, locations of safe houses they have identified and watch, information about which sheriffs can be bribed and which cannot. If I give you this information, will you help us?" Sarah took the papers and examined them carefully. "Where did you get this? I'm a planter. Other planters talk freely around me. They assume I share their interests. This information could save lives," Edward said. "People other than just my family. Help us escape, and it is yours." After a long silence, Sarah nodded slowly. "If you betray us, if this is a trap, you will not live long enough to regret it. It is not a trap. Then we will help. But understand this. Once you start down this path, there is no return. You will be a fugitive. Your name will be destroyed. You will never see your legitimate children again. Do you understand what you are giving up?" "Everything," Edward said quietly. "I am giving up everything." The Abolitionist Connection, through a trusted slave at Riverside who had connections to the Underground Railroad, Edward made contact with a network he had spent his entire life condemning. The abolitionists were suspicious at first, convinced that this was a trap set by a slaveholder trying to expose their operations. They had seen such tactics before, planters posing as sympathizers, gaining trust, then leading authorities to safe houses where fugitives hid. The network had learned to be cautious, to verify every claim, to trust no white Southerner without extensive proof of genuine intent. But Edward brought them something that changed their minds: detailed maps of patrol routes, information about slave-catching operations, and the names of planters who were rumored to be trafficking in illegally imported slaves. After Congress banned the international slave trade in 1808, a black market had emerged, with certain planters bringing in Africans through Caribbean ports and falsifying documentation. Edward knew which planters participated in this traffic because they had approached him about joining their operations. He had declined, but had kept careful notes about their methods, their contacts, their shipping routes. In exchange for this information, the abolitionists agreed to help him and Celeste disappear. But they imposed conditions. First, Edward would provide funding to help at least 10 other fugitive slaves escape along the same route. His flight would serve a larger purpose than simply his own freedom. Second, he would write a detailed account of plantation operations, documenting the daily realities of slavery from an insider's perspective. This account would be published anonymously in abolitionist newspapers throughout the North. Third, once he reached free territory, he would continue providing information about Southern planters and their operations, serving as an informant for the abolitionist cause. Edward agreed to all of it. His transformation from slaveholder to abolitionist conspirator happened gradually over the weeks of planning. The more he worked with Sarah Thompson and her network, the more he understood how thoroughly he had been complicit in an evil system. He had always told himself that he was a good master, that his slaves were well treated, that he bore no responsibility for the larger institution. But sitting in those midnight meetings, hearing stories of families separated, of children sold away from mothers, of brutality so casual it barely registered as noteworthy, Edward confronted truths he had spent his adult life avoiding. The plan they developed was intricate and dangerous. Edward would announce that he was traveling to inspect cotton markets in Memphis, a trip that would not seem unusual. He would take Celeste and the children with him, ostensibly to sell them at the Memphis slave market where prices were higher. This would explain why he was traveling with 5 slaves and would give them legitimate papers for the first leg of the journey. In Memphis, they would connect with Underground Railroad contacts who would provide them with new identities and route them north through a series of safe houses in Tennessee, Kentucky, and Ohio. The journey would take at least 6 weeks, moving mostly at night, avoiding main roads, relying on guides who knew every hidden path and river crossing. If all went according to plan, they would reach Canada by late summer. If the plan failed, Edward would be arrested for slave theft, and Celeste and the children would be returned to Margaret as property, likely sold south as punishment for attempted escape. The stakes could not have been higher. The probability of success could not have been lower. But Edward had made his choice. Now he simply needed the courage to follow through with it, knowing that once they left Riverside, there would be no possibility of return. The night they vanished. May 3rd, 1847, was Margaret Bellamy's 40th birthday, celebrated with a gathering of 50 guests that lasted until well after midnight. Edward played his role perfectly, the attentive husband, ensuring his wife's champagne glass never emptied. He gave a toast praising her grace and dignity. He danced with her when the musicians played. He laughed at appropriate moments and conversed with guests about politics and cotton prices. No one watching him that evening would have suspected that he was hours away from abandoning everything he had spent 15 years building. Margaret accepted his performance with the same cold courtesy she had shown him for months. She knew Edward had not resolved the situation with Celeste. The deadline she had imposed had passed, and Celeste remained at Riverside, a continued insult to Margaret's authority. But Margaret had decided to wait until after her birthday celebration to force the issue. She would not let Edward's failures ruin the one evening of the year when society gathered to honor her. The party finally ended around 2 in the morning. The last guests departed in their carriages, calling out birthday wishes as they rolled down the oak-lined drive. Margaret retired to her chambers, exhausted but satisfied that the evening had been a social success. She assumed Edward would follow his usual pattern, waiting until she was settled before making his way to Celeste's house for whatever remained of the night. But when the last guest departed and Margaret retired to her chambers, Edward did not follow. Instead, he walked to the small house behind the plantation, where Celeste waited with their 4 children, a single trunk of possessions and papers of manumission that Edward had forged with trembling hands. The papers were crude forgeries that would not withstand careful scrutiny, but they would serve for the initial journey. By the time anyone examined them closely, Edward hoped to be hundreds of miles away. The children were already dressed in traveling clothes, confused about why they were leaving in the middle of the night but trained to obedience. Sarah, the eldest at 9, held the hand of Thomas, the youngest at 2. The middle children, James and Elizabeth, stood close to their mother, their faces showing the fear they had been told not to express. Celeste herself wore the plain dress of a slave woman with a head covering that would help her blend in with other enslaved people they might encounter on the road. She carried nothing but the small bundle Edward had given her, containing a few personal items and the letters he had written to her over the years. "Are you certain?" Celeste asked him one final time. "Once we leave, there is no return." "I am certain," Edward said, though his hands shook as he picked up Thomas. By dawn, they were on a boat heading north, the first leg of a journey that would take them through Memphis, then overland through Tennessee and Kentucky, then across the Ohio River into free territory, and finally, if they survived all of it, to Canada and whatever uncertain future awaited them there. Behind them, Riverside Plantation slept in the darkness, unaware that by morning its master would be gone and its carefully maintained social order would collapse into scandal. Marcus, the slave who had arranged Edward's contact with the Underground Railroad, watched the boat disappear into the pre-dawn mist. Then he returned to the slave quarters to wait for the chaos that would begin when Margaret Bellamy discovered that her husband had vanished in the night, taking with him the woman who had destroyed their marriage and the children who represented his ultimate betrayal. The letter. Margaret found it on Edward's desk the next morning, written in his precise handwriting on expensive paper. She had risen early, as was her habit, and had gone to his study to review household accounts. When she noticed the envelope propped against the inkwell with her name written on it, She felt a cold certainty settle into her stomach. She knew, before opening it, that Edward had made his choice. She knew that he had chosen Celeste. The letter read, "My dearest Margaret, by the time you read this, I will have committed an act that society will call unforgivable. I will not insult you by claiming that what I do is justified or righteous. I know only that I can no longer live divided. I have loved two women in my life. I married one and enslaved the other. This is my attempt to correct at least part of that terrible equation. You deserved a better husband than I have been. You deserved a man who could love you as you needed to be loved. You deserved a marriage built on more than property arrangements and social ambition. I have failed you in every way that matters, and for that I am deeply sorry. But I cannot continue to fail both you and her by maintaining a situation that dishonors us all. She deserved to never be property. Our children deserved a father who did not have to choose between legitimacy and acknowledgement. Your children deserved a father who was fully present instead of perpetually divided. I have tried for a decade to be what everyone needed me to be, and I have succeeded only in making everyone miserable. I am taking Celeste and our 4 children north. I do not know if we will reach free territory. I do not know if we will survive the journey. But I know that I must try. I cannot sell her away to please you, and I cannot continue to enslave her to maintain my position. So I am choosing the only path that allows her to be free and allows me to live without dividing myself between duty and love. Riverside is yours now. The property, the remaining slaves, all of it. My attorney has documents that will transfer everything to your name. You will be a wealthy widow, and society will pity you for having been abandoned by a husband who clearly went mad. Use that pity. Rebuild your reputation. Give our children the stable home they deserve. Forgive me if you can. Forget me if you cannot. I know I have destroyed your life as thoroughly as I have destroyed my own. But I could not see any other way forward that did not require me to continue betraying either you or her. In choosing her, I acknowledge that I am betraying you one final time. It is the last betrayal I will be capable of inflicting, as I will be gone from your life entirely. Edward. Margaret read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in her desk drawer. She did not cry. She did not scream. She sat in perfect stillness for perhaps 20 minutes, her hands folded in her lap, her face revealing nothing. Then she stood, smoothed her dress, and went to inform the household that the master had departed on unexpected business. No one needed to know yet that he would never return. That revelation could wait until she decided how to manage the scandal that was coming. But first, she needed to send word to her family. She needed to contact Edward's attorney. She needed to begin the careful work of transforming her husband's abandonment into a narrative she could survive. And she needed to do it all before anyone discovered that Edward Bellamy had not simply left on business, but had run away with his slaves in open defiance of every law and custom that governed their world. The scandal explodes. The story hit New Orleans newspapers within 48 hours, and from there it spread like fire through dry timber. A plantation owner eloping with his slave was shocking enough. But Edward Bellamy had taken it further by also kidnapping 4 children who were technically still property of Riverside Plantation, by forging manumission papers, and by stealing what amounted to several $1,000s in human chattel. The legal implications alone made the story irresistible to editors who understood what their readers wanted: scandal, outrage, and confirmation that the Northern abolitionist movement was corrupting Southern gentlemen. The New Orleans Picayune published the first account under the headline, "Respected Planter Abandons Wife for Negro Slave." The article detailed Edward's distinguished family background, his marriage to Margaret Whitmore, the social position he had abandoned. It portrayed him as a victim of abolitionist propaganda, a man of weak character who had allowed himself to be seduced by his own property. The article barely mentioned Celeste except as the slave woman who bewitched him, and made no reference to the fact that Edward had fathered her children. Margaret's family demanded that authorities pursue criminal charges. Her father, still influential despite his advancing age, met with the Louisiana governor personally to demand action. The charge would be grand theft, specifically the theft of 5 slaves valued at approximately $4,000. If Edward was caught and returned to Louisiana, he would face trial, imprisonment, and financial ruin. His legitimate children would be tainted by association with a father who had committed such a public betrayal of Southern values. The Louisiana governor offered a reward of $500 for information leading to Edward's capture. Private bounty hunters, always eager for such work, began organizing search parties. Slave catchers with dogs were hired to track the fugitives. Newspapers in Memphis, Nashville, and Louisville were sent descriptions of Edward and Celeste, along with instructions to alert authorities if they were spotted. But the story took on larger significance beyond just one man's crime. Abolitionist newspapers in the North seized on the scandal as evidence that even slaveholders recognized the immorality of the institution. The National Anti-Slavery Standard published an editorial praising Edward's moral courage in choosing love and freedom over property and prejudice. They reprinted his letter to Margaret, which had somehow been leaked to the press, and held it up as proof that the best men of the South were beginning to reject slavery. Southern newspapers responded with fury. The Charleston Mercury published a series of editorials arguing that Edward Bellamy represented not moral courage, but moral collapse. They claimed that abolitionists had deliberately corrupted him, that his actions proved the dangerous influence of Northern propaganda on weak-minded Southerners. They demanded stricter laws governing manumission and harsher penalties for those who aided fugitive slaves. The scandal became a weapon in the larger political battle over slavery. Northern politicians used it as evidence that the institution could not be maintained without violence to conscience. Southern politicians used it as evidence that the North sought to destroy Southern families through moral corruption. And Edward Bellamy, somewhere between Louisiana and freedom, became a symbol that neither side fully understood. A man who had simply tried to love honestly in a society that made honesty impossible. Margaret watched the scandal unfold with a combination of fury and calculation. She gave carefully scripted interviews to sympathetic newspapers, describing herself as the victim of her husband's temporary madness brought on by abolitionist influence. She portrayed Edward as having been corrupted by Northern ideas during his years at Harvard. She never mentioned the arrangement they had maintained for nearly a decade. She never acknowledged that she had known about Celeste and the children. Instead, she performed the role of the shocked, betrayed wife, and society accepted the performance because it was easier than confronting the more complex truth. The hunt slave catchers, bounty hunters, and even private investigators hired by Margaret's family fanned out across the South looking for Edward Bellamy and his escaped slaves. The $500 reward offered by the governor attracted professionals who made their living tracking fugitives. These were men who knew every route north, every river crossing, every town where fugitive slaves might find temporary shelter. They worked with networks of informants, paid local sheriffs for information, and employed tracking dogs bred specifically for hunting humans. The hunt began in Memphis, where Edward had told his overseers he was going to inspect cotton markets. Investigators confirmed that he had arrived in the city on May 4th with 5 slaves matching the descriptions of Celeste and the children. He had checked into a hotel under his own name. He had conducted no business, and he had disappeared 2 days later, leaving the hotel without settling his account. This was where the trail went cold. Edward had made contact with his Underground Railroad connections in Memphis, and from that point forward, the fugitives ceased to exist under their real names. The network moved them through a series of safe houses in Tennessee, each stop carefully coordinated, each host knowing only the next destination, never the final goal. Edward became Mr. Bell, a free man of color traveling with his family. Celeste became his wife. The children learned new names and practiced the stories they would tell if questioned. But the hunt continued. Slave catchers traced them to a farm outside Nashville, arriving 3 days after the fugitives had left. They traced them to a Quaker settlement in Kentucky, arriving 2 days behind. They were closing the distance. The dogs picked up scents. Local sheriffs began watching known Underground Railroad routes more carefully. Rewards were posted in every town from Memphis to Cincinnati. The closest call came at a river crossing in southern Ohio. Edward and his family were being moved at night by a conductor who knew the safest route across the Ohio River into free territory. But a slave catcher's informant had seen them boarding the boat. The catcher and 3 men with dogs arrived at the riverbank just as the boat reached the far shore. They could see Edward helping Celeste and the children onto the dock on the Ohio side. They shouted for the fugitives to stop. They fired shots into the air. But they could not cross into Ohio without facing arrest themselves. Slave catchers had no legal authority in free states. They could only watch as Edward and his family ran into the darkness on the far shore, disappearing into the woods where local abolitionists waited to guide them to the next safe house. The slave catcher sent word back to Louisiana that the fugitives had reached free territory, but promised that the hunt would continue. Ohio might not permit slave catching, but there were still ways to capture fugitives, still bounty hunters willing to work outside the law. Edward and Celeste kept moving. Through Ohio in a series of midnight journeys, into Pennsylvania, where the children cried from exhaustion, but kept walking because stopping meant capture. Across New York State to the Canadian border, where Edward spent his last American dollars bribing a border guard to let them pass without examining their papers too closely. And finally, in late June 1847, nearly 2 months after fleeing Riverside Plantation, they crossed into Canada and collapsed with exhaustion in a settlement of fugitive slaves outside Toronto. They had made it. 5 people had traveled over 1,000 miles through slave territory in free states, evading professional hunters and risking death at every river crossing. They were alive. They were together. And they were, for the first time in their lives, genuinely free. But the cost of that freedom was everything Edward had known, everyone he had left behind, and the certainty that he could never return to the country of his birth without facing arrest and imprisonment. Life in Canada. They settled finally in a small farming community outside Toronto, where slavery had been abolished for more than a decade and where mixed-race families, while unusual, were not unheard of. The community was home to perhaps 300 fugitive slaves who had made the same dangerous journey, along with free black Canadians and a handful of white abolitionists who provided support to the refugee population. Edward Bellamy became Edward Bell, a farmer and schoolteacher who claimed to be widowed and remarried to a Creole woman from Louisiana. The story was thin, but the community chose to accept it, perhaps because they recognized the desperation beneath it. Everyone in the settlement had secrets. Everyone had left something behind. The unspoken rule was not to ask too many questions about anyone's past. What mattered was that you contributed to the community, that you helped your neighbors, that you worked to build a future rather than dwelling on what could not be changed. Edward purchased a small farm with money he had managed to bring north, 40 acres that he worked with his own hands for the first time in his life. He had never performed manual labor at Riverside. That was what slaves did while he managed accounts and made decisions. But in Canada, there were no slaves, and Edward discovered that he did not mind the physical work. There was something cleansing about plowing fields and mending fences, something that felt like penance for the years he had lived off the labor of others. Celeste transformed as well. For the first time in her life, she was not property. She could walk into town without papers. She could speak to white people as an equal. She could make decisions about her own children, without fearing that they might be sold away from her. The freedom was disorienting at first. She had spent 28 years enslaved, learning to navigate a world where her personhood was legally denied. Now she had to learn different skills: how to negotiate with shopkeepers, how to participate in community meetings, how to raise children who would grow up free. The children adapted faster than their parents. Sarah, the eldest, enrolled in a school run by Quaker missionaries and proved to be a brilliant student. James and Elizabeth made friends with other refugee children, playing games and attending lessons without the shadow of slavery hanging over them. Thomas, the youngest, would grow up with no memory of Louisiana, no memory of being property, no memory of hiding in safe houses while dogs barked in the distance. But Edward and Celeste never fully escaped their past. Edward would wake sometimes in the night, disoriented, believing himself back at Riverside. He would dream of Margaret's face when she read his letter. He would dream of his legitimate children, Edward Jr. and Caroline, growing up without him, learning to hate the father who had abandoned them. He would dream of the plantation burning, though he had no way of knowing whether it still stood or had been sold off piece by piece. Celeste would wake from nightmares where she was being dragged back south in chains. She would check on the children multiple times each night, needing to confirm they were still safe, still free, still hers. She would stand at the window of their small house and stare south, thinking of the people she had left behind at Riverside, the other slaves who had not escaped, who continued working under whatever master now owned them. They lived quietly, working their farm, raising their children, participating in the community, but always maintaining a careful distance. They never formalized their union through marriage, knowing that any legal scrutiny might reveal their true identities. They never returned to the United States, not even to visit the cities where they had allies. They built a life that was modest but stable, free but haunted, safe but never entirely at peace. Margaret's revenge. Margaret Bellamy did not remarry. She did not retreat into quiet widowhood. Instead, she became something far more dangerous, a vocal opponent of what she called the seduction of Southern gentlemen by inferior races. The scandal that might have destroyed her became instead the foundation of a new identity. She transformed herself from Edward's abandoned wife into a symbol of Southern womanhood, betrayed by abolition's corrupting influence. She gave interviews to sympathetic newspapers describing Edward as a victim of his own misplaced kindness, corrupted by a calculating slave woman who had used feminine wiles to destroy a respectable family. In her telling, Celeste became a seductress who had deliberately entrapped a weak-minded master. Edward became not a man who made a choice, but a victim of moral corruption spread by Northern abolitionists who sought to destroy Southern families from within. The narrative she constructed was self-serving, but effective. It allowed Southern society to sympathize with Margaret while condemning Edward. It provided an explanation for his actions that did not require anyone to question the institution of slavery itself. The problem was not that slavery forced impossible choices. The problem was that weak men allowed themselves to be corrupted by their own property. The solution was not ending slavery, but maintaining stricter control over slaves and stricter vigilance against abolitionist propaganda. Margaret lobbied for stricter laws governing the manumission of slaves and for harsher penalties for slave theft. She wrote letters to state legislators arguing that manumission should require the consent of all family members, not just the slave's owner. She pushed for laws that would make it easier to reclaim fugitive slaves who escaped to free states. She became, in effect, a spokeswoman for the most reactionary elements of the slaveholding class. Her family supported her transformation. They provided money for her campaigns. They connected her with influential politicians and newspaper editors. They helped her publish a memoir titled Betrayed by Benevolence, a Southern lady's account of her husband's corruption. The book portrayed Edward as having been too kind to his slaves, too lenient in his discipline, too willing to treat them as nearly human. This kindness, Margaret argued, had created the conditions for Celeste to manipulate him. The memoir became a bestseller throughout the South. It was serialized in newspapers. It was cited in legislative debates about strengthening fugitive slave laws. It made Margaret wealthy and influential in ways she had never been as simply Edward's wife. The scandal that should have ruined her instead gave her power she had never possessed, and she wielded that power with cold efficiency to ensure that Edward's name became synonymous with betrayal and degradation. She made certain that Edward Bellamy's name appeared in every discussion of the dangers of abolitionism. She ensured that her children grew up believing their father had been corrupted by evil influences. She worked tirelessly to destroy any sympathy that might exist for Edward's choice, to ensure that his story served as a cautionary tale rather than an inspiration. And in this, she largely succeeded. By 1850, Edward Bellamy was remembered throughout the South, not as a man who chose love over law, but as a traitor who had betrayed his race, his class, and his family for a slave woman. Margaret never spoke Celeste's name in public. She never acknowledged that the slave woman had a name, a history, or agency in what happened. In Margaret's telling, Celeste was simply an object that had been misused, a tool that had broken when handled improperly. The erasure was deliberate and complete. Margaret's revenge was not just destroying Edward's reputation, but ensuring that Celeste disappeared from the story entirely, remembered only as an unnamed temptation rather than a woman who had loved and been loved. The children's fate. The 4 children Edward and Celeste, brought to Canada, grew up in a state of permanent liminality, neither fully white nor fully black, neither fully American nor fully Canadian. They carried names that were not their birth names, told stories that were not their true stories, and lived always with the knowledge that their existence in Canada depended on maintaining lies about who they had been in Louisiana. The psychological weight of this fractured identity affected each child differently. Sarah, the eldest daughter, married a white shopkeeper in 1856 when she was 18 years old. Her husband knew her only as Sarah Bell, daughter of a schoolteacher and his Creole wife. She never told him about Louisiana, about Riverside Plantation, about being born into slavery. When her skin produced children lighter than herself, she passed completely into white society, severing all contact with her parents and siblings. She moved to Montreal, changed her name again, and disappeared into the white middle class. Her children and grandchildren never knew they had black ancestry. The secret died with her in 1901. James, the second child and eldest son, took a different path. He moved to Boston in 1860 and became involved in abolitionist circles, speaking publicly about his unusual upbringing. He did not use the Bellamy name, but called himself James Freeman, a fugitive from Louisiana, who had been born into slavery to a white father who eventually freed him. The partial truth allowed him to become a powerful voice for abolition without fully exposing his parents' story. He published a memoir in 1863 that became a bestseller in the North, describing his childhood at Riverside Plantation and his escape to Canada. He never mentioned his father's name, only that a Southern gentleman of conscience had chosen freedom for his enslaved family. Elizabeth, the third child, remained in Canada and became a teacher in schools for fugitive slave children. She married a Canadian-born black man and raised 5 children who grew up knowing their grandmother had been enslaved, but not knowing the full complexity of their grandfather's story. Elizabeth maintained contact with both Sarah before she disappeared into white society and James in Boston. She became the keeper of family history, the one who remembered everything and wrote it down in journals that her descendants would discover decades later. Thomas, the youngest, remembered almost nothing of Louisiana. He was 2 years old when they fled, and his memories began in Canada. He grew up believing himself simply Canadian, the son of a farmer and schoolteacher. He learned carpentry and worked building houses throughout Ontario. He married, had children, and lived a quiet life largely untouched by the trauma that shaped his older siblings. But even he sometimes felt the weight of secrets kept, the sense that his family carried histories they could not fully share. None of them ever returned to Louisiana. Even after the Civil War ended and slavery was abolished, the South remained too dangerous for people with their history. Margaret was still alive, still influential, still capable of causing trouble for anyone connected to Edward Bellamy's scandal. The children built lives in the North and in Canada, always aware that they carried a story that could not be fully told, that their existence challenged categories their world depended on maintaining. A few of them, when they reached adulthood, attempted to find the graves of siblings they barely remembered. They learned from anti-slavery newspapers that 17 babies had died at Bellevue Plantation in Louisiana during the Colonel's breeding experiments. They traveled to Louisiana only to discover that the cemetery at Bellevue had been plowed under after the property was sold during Reconstruction. The headstones had been destroyed. The bodies had been relocated to an unmarked mass grave. Even in death, the children who had died as part of the breeding program were denied the dignity of marked graves, their existence erased as completely as their lives had been controlled. Edward's final years. Edward Bellamy died in 1862 in a small house outside Toronto, holding Celeste's hand. He was 53 years old and had spent the last 15 years of his life as a fugitive from Southern justice, unable to return home, unable to reclaim his property or his name, but living as a free man in ways that mattered more than legal status. The death certificate listed his name as Edward Bell and gave his occupation as farmer and schoolteacher. It made no mention of Riverside Plantation, of Margaret, of the scandal that had made his name infamous throughout the South. In those final years, Edward had written extensively in a journal that would later be discovered by his grandchildren. The journal documented his reasons for leaving, his regrets about the pain he caused, and his absolute certainty that despite everything, his choice had been the right one. The entries revealed a man who never stopped questioning himself, never stopped calculating the cost of his decision, but who also never wavered in believing that love and freedom were worth that cost. One entry from 1860 read, "Today I received word that Margaret has published another edition of her memoir. They tell me she has added new chapters condemning the abolitionist movement and blaming them for corrupting Southern gentlemen. She makes me out to be a madman, and perhaps she is right. Perhaps only madness could have driven me to do what I did. But if it was madness, it was a madness that brought clarity. I see my children growing up free. I see Celeste walk into town without papers. I see them live without fear of being sold away from each other. If this is madness, I choose it again every day." Another entry from 1861, as news of the Civil War reached Canada. "The country tears itself apart over the question I tried to answer in my own small way. Men are dying by the thousands to determine whether slavery will continue or end. I think of Riverside, of the people I owned, of the labor I extracted from them. I think of my complicity in that system and wonder if my escape absolves me or merely makes me a coward who ran rather than fighting to change what I knew was wrong. Celeste tells me I should not torture myself with such questions. She says I did what I could, that one man cannot dismantle an entire system. But I wonder what might have happened if I had stayed and used my position to fight against slavery rather than simply fleeing from it." A final entry, written weeks before his death. "I am dying. The doctor says my heart is failing, worn out from years of stress and manual labor my body was never trained to perform. I find I am not afraid. I have lived these 15 years in Canada with more honesty than I lived my previous 38 years in Louisiana. I have been a true husband to Celeste, not a master pretending at affection. I have been a true father to our children, not a man divided between legitimate and shadow families." I have worked with my own hands instead of profiting from the labor of others. These years have been harder than anything I knew in Louisiana, but they have also been more real. I regret the pain I caused Margaret and my legitimate children. I regret that I did not find courage earlier, before so many years were wasted. But I do not regret choosing love over law. I do not regret choosing freedom over property. I do not regret choosing to live honestly over living comfortably. If I have any wisdom to pass to my children, it is this: the world will try to make you choose between what is right and what is acceptable. Choose right, even when the cost is everything you have. Edward was buried in a cemetery outside Toronto, where other fugitive slaves had found their final rest. His gravestone bore only the name Edward Bell and the dates 1809, 1862. Celeste placed flowers on his grave every week for the next 27 years until her own death. She never remarried. She told people who asked that she had loved once, completely, and that was enough for one lifetime. Celeste's long memory. Celeste lived until 1889, long enough to see slavery abolished, long enough to see her grandchildren born free, long enough to return once to Louisiana and stand at the gates of Riverside Plantation, which had been divided and sold after the Civil War. She made the journey in 1885, when she was 70 years old, traveling by train with her daughter Elizabeth. The plantation that had been her prison for 10 years no longer existed as a single property. The land had been broken up and sold to small farmers during Reconstruction. The main house had burned in 1870, though whether by accident or arson was never determined. Only the gates remained, rusted and hanging crooked, with Riverside barely legible on the ironwork. Celeste stood at those gates for nearly an hour, saying nothing, while Elizabeth waited beside her. Finally, Elizabeth asked what she was thinking. Celeste replied, "I am remembering who I was when I lived here, and I am grateful she does not exist anymore." They did not enter the property. There was nothing there that Celeste needed to reclaim. She had come only to confirm that the place which had defined so much of her life was truly gone, that it held no power over her anymore. She never spoke publicly about her life with Edward Bellamy. She never wrote a memoir or gave interviews to the journalists who occasionally found their way to her door, having heard rumors about the scandal. When abolitionists asked her to speak at gatherings about her experience escaping from slavery, she declined. Her past was not a story for public consumption. It was her own, and she guarded it carefully, sharing pieces only with her children and later with her grandchildren, teaching them where they came from without burdening them with the full weight of what she had endured. But she kept every letter Edward had ever written to her, kept the forged manumission papers that had helped them escape, kept the few photographs that existed of their years in Canada. These items filled a small trunk that she stored under her bed. Sometimes, late at night when she could not sleep, she would open the trunk and read through the letters, running her fingers over Edward's handwriting, remembering the man who had given up everything to choose her. The letters revealed a love story that was complicated and imperfect, marked by the enormous power imbalance of their early relationship, but also by genuine affection that had somehow survived impossible circumstances. They revealed Edward's struggle with his own complicity in slavery, his growing understanding that love without freedom was not really love at all. They revealed Celeste's own complex feelings, her gratitude mixed with anger, her love mixed with awareness that she had never asked to be placed in the position of destroying a family. When Celeste died at the age of 74, she was buried next to Edward in the cemetery outside Toronto. Their shared headstone bore only their assumed names, Edward and Celeste Bell, and the dates they had chosen to count as their real life together, 1847, 1889. The years before their escape were not counted. Those years belonged to different people, to a master and his slave, to a man divided and a woman enslaved. The people buried beneath that headstone had been born on the night they crossed into Canada, and those were the only years that mattered. Elizabeth inherited the trunk of letters and documents. She read through them all, understanding for the first time the full complexity of her parents' story. Then she sealed the trunk again and placed it in her attic, where it would remain for another 60 years until her own granddaughter discovered it in 1950 and began the work of piecing together a family history that challenged everything the official record claimed about Edward Bellamy, Margaret Bellamy, and the plantation that had been both prison and home for the woman whose love had changed everything.